Welcome back. My name is Josh Stieber. I'm honored to lead off the veterans portion of tonight's show. Now, we just heard two brilliant examinations of the bigger picture of the war economy and the political situation that's behind it and how it connects to us. But I'm going to look at that now from a different angle, from the bottom up rather than from the top down. And it's an angle that echoes the Martin Luther King Jr. quote that we just heard. So I'd like to emphasize one part of the quote that was just recited, the part that says, "We are called to play the Good Samaritan on life's roadside, but that will only be an initial act. One day we must come to see that the whole Jericho road must be transformed." And that's part of the transformation of a soldier. For me, it began with the appeal of being a good Samaritan. That's how the war was sold to me, that we were going to spread freedom and democracy, that we were going to help and oppress people. I didn't ask a lot of questions about that and bought into that rhetoric and enlisted in the Army right after I graduated from high school. And it took the process of going to Iraq and seeing a lot of the things that we just saw in the slideshow and much more up close, and seeing the human connection to that, to get me to go from just seeing myself as a good Samaritan, but of seeing a bigger road that needed to be examined. And if we just think about the moral framework that these wars are presented to us in, our side is presented as the good side, and if there's an exception, then that's treated as nothing that points back to the broader institution. But if the other side does something wrong, that's a further example to say that they're corrupt and that they need to be changed, they need to be fixed, whatever. So my story is essentially one of identifying, to borrow Martin Luther King's analogy, of borrowing the idea of going from seeing bricks that we say, here's an atrocity, here's a wrongdoing, and we'll just push that to the side. That doesn't reflect on the broader thing, but of starting to connect all these bricks and see the wider road that does need to be transformed. It definitely took a while for me to get to that point. I made a lot of excuses along the way. I found myself in basic training shortly after I graduated from high school in 2006. And I would see different things that would challenge the assumptions that I had and would seem to contradict these high rhetorical and moral levels that had been used to convince me that the war was justified. We would watch videos that had bombs dropping on Middle Eastern villages and just death and destruction, and there would be rock and roll music in the background to a song called Die Terrorist Die. And pretty soon you have a room full of young people who, probably most of them at the beginning thought they were good Samaritans, pretty quickly start chanting Die Terrorist Die and really celebrating and glorifying this death and destruction. And I saw that, and I saw that it was a contradiction. But I said, that doesn't have a broader impact on how I view the overall structure. The ends, spreading freedom and democracy and all that, justify these very questionable means. And so I pushed that out of my mind. I wasn't able to make those connections yet. And it took many other examples like that, continually building along the way. Other instances in basic training, we would sing cadences that joked about killing women and children, and again, that stuff was pushed to the side. And then came time to get ready to go to Iraq for me, and that was early in 2007. And in the days leading up to us starting to do missions once we were there, the leaders who had been to Iraq before took myself and the other soldiers who hadn't deployed yet into a room one at a time, and they would ask us a series of questions all leading up to the big one, which was if we were to go into a marketplace full of civilians just shopping around and someone were to pull a weapon out, would we open fire on that person? I was asked that question, and I asked a clarification question in response. That was the wrong answer. The right answer was to say yes without any hesitation. If you hesitated, then you were told you didn't have what it took to survive. You had to be ready to pull the trigger at an instant. And obviously that contradicted with all these ideas I had about, liberating people and freeing the oppressed. But again, I pushed that to the side, and so many other examples like that. Another contradiction I saw was that here I was thinking that we were spreading democracy, the voice of the people. And when we got to Iraq, we moved into the poor industrial part of Baghdad, and we were moving into a factory there. And as we were moving in, the voice of the people was loudly heard. They came out and held a large peaceful protest and told us that they didn't want us in their neighborhood. And we ignored that. And we forced our way through and positioned ourselves in this warehouse, and within a couple of days had a big barricade up around the full city block, displacing a lot of people from their homes. So the democracy, the voice of the people was ignored. We forced our way through. And in response, the locals started trying to tell us more violently that they didn't like what was going on. So they started planting roadside bombs and using snipers. And we would respond even more forcefully. And it just became this huge escalation where they would attack, we would attack more severely, they would attack more severely. And things escalated to the point where we were doing some pretty messed up things. My unit was involved in the incident that was shown in the WikiLeaks video titled Collateral Murder. And we would have a lot of other policies too that just violated so many of the ideals that I had enlisted for. And it got to the point where essentially our strategy, and our leaders were saying this in certain words, that our strategy was to try to out-terrorize the terrorists by intimidating them to stop attacking us. That was the goal of making each response more intense. So if a roadside bomb went off, it got to the point where we were told we could open fire on civilians to supposedly keep ourselves safe. And I mean, that gets back to what Gareth was talking about, where you just attract more and more, and it continues to spread. So I started to see these contradictions and these ideals that I had fall apart through these contradictions. And the things that I thought wouldn't work, I actually started to see work. So violence wasn't working. Violence was making the situation worse. But the opposite of that, of compromise and negotiation, I thought that would never work. I believed the president when he said you can't negotiate with terrorists. But we did exactly that. We had arrested this guy at one point in our deployment early on, and we had evidence that he was part of an IED ring, roadside bomb ring. And we were all set to send him to prison until we found out that he was the mayor of the district that we were living in. And when we found that out, we released him and started negotiating with him and made far more progress than we did trying to use violence to solve all our problems. So pretty much all my assumptions and ideals got turned on their head, and I really started questioning things and really started trying to reevaluate things. And that process for me, I think, leads to two things that I'd like to leave all of you with, two ideas to consider as we evaluate the war economy and what we can do about it. So the first one that had a major impact in my story was the issue of setting the record straight, of moving beyond making excuses, and of starting to see the bigger picture, of doing what Martin Luther King was talking about, and not just seeing isolated bricks, but of starting to recognize an overall structure and seeing a road that needed to be transformed. So I started doing that and started seeing that on a wider scale, that we were making these negotiations with people that we said were our enemies, that were used to propel the war, and the surge was sold into all that, and that's what I deployed in. And even that narrative keeps getting repeated, that superior firepower can solve these problems. It's being attempted again in Afghanistan. But it was through compromise and negotiation, largely through people who had attacked us, not through superior firepower. So that's an important thing as we look to wars ahead and the arguments that people are going to make to try and sell them to us. And the other important issue that I'm not going to have time to elaborate more on, but the other veterans will, are not only taking a stand outwardly against the things that are wrong, but of taking a stand inwardly. And so just to summarize my story, I ended up getting out as a conscientious objector, and that required standing up to my leaders, not only of saying what we were doing externally was wrong, but of also trying to recognize why people in the military were continuing to enlist and the things that were getting them to carry things out. And so by targeting again, of even recognizing good through seeing that people at one point maybe wanted to be a good Samaritan, and how that got twisted, and how to unlock that is part of this overall idea of how we create transformation. So it's this inward transformation and outward as well. And you'll get to hear that story more through the other veterans who are speaking with me. Thank you.